Tonight, we're remembering 10 R&B songs from the 1970s that were banned, censored, or quietly pushed off the radio. Records that made people uncomfortable, challenged the moment they were released into, or simply said something the gatekeepers didn't want heard. In those days, R&B wasn't just about love or heartbreak. It was also about truth, about frustration, about communities finding their voice through a record spinning late at night.
Don't you feel like sweet and sexy?
And the final one on this list might be the most powerful message ever briefly silenced. We'll begin with number 10. Number 10, Give the People What They Want by the OJs. By the early 1970s, soul music had started to sound a little different. It still had the warmth, still had the groove, but underneath the rhythm, there was something sharper, something that sounded like the streets speaking back. This song arrived in 1979 during a moment when many artists were beginning to ask louder questions about fairness, power, and the distance between promises and reality. While some stations embraced that honesty, others grew uneasy. What made the record stand out wasn't anger, it was clarity. The voices of Eddie Leverett and Walter Williams didn't shout. They carried the message with calm conviction, riding over a groove that felt almost celebratory. But the lyrics asked something direct, something that made a few program directors nervous enough to quietly keep it off their playlists. Not because it was loud, because it was honest. Still, listeners found it. Records like this had a way of traveling through house parties, car radios after midnight, and the steady hum of neighborhood record stores. For a lot of people, it felt less like protest and more like recognition. A song that simply said what many were already thinking, and finally hearing out loud. And once you heard it, it was hard to pretend you hadn't. Number 9, Smiling Faces Sometimes by the Undisputed Truth.
Faces sometimes breathe.
Not every band song sounded angry. Some of them sounded almost gentle, until you really listened. This record arrived in 1971 during a time when soul music was beginning to reflect a growing sense of caution. The optimism of the previous decade hadn't disappeared, but people were starting to recognize that not every friendly face carried honest intentions. The groove moved slowly, almost hypnotically. Strings floated in the background while the vocals delivered a warning that felt more like quiet wisdom than accusation.
A smile is just a frown turned upside down.
What unsettled some stations wasn't profanity or volume. It was the message. The song spoke openly about deception, about people who smile warmly while quietly working against you. In a period already tense with political distrust and social change, some broadcasters worried the record might deepen suspicion or stir discomfort among listeners. So in certain markets, it simply vanished from playlists. But records have a way of slipping through cracks. Listeners heard it anyway. Late-night radio shows, jukeboxes, and neighborhood bars. The faint echo of it drifting through open apartment windows on summer evenings. And for many people, it felt less like a warning and more like hard-earned truth, the kind you only recognize after life teaches it to you. Number 8, For the Love of Money by the OJs. If the previous song spoke quietly, this one walked in with confidence. Released in 1973, it opened with one of the most unforgettable bass lines of the decade. Dark, steady, and impossible to ignore. Before a single lyric arrived, you already knew this record was going somewhere serious. The song explored something every generation eventually wrestles with: the strange pull money can have over people.
Because I never know when the world that's gonna be more than me.
Friendships strained, families divided, values bending in ways nobody expected. Some radio stations hesitated not because the record was crude. It wasn't. but because its message felt uncomfortably direct. It talked about greed without dressing it up, and a few broadcasters feared it sounded too close to criticism of the system itself. So in certain areas, the airwaves stayed quiet. But listeners didn't need permission to feel the truth inside it. The groove alone carried enough gravity to stop conversations in a room, and when those voices rose together in the chorus, the warning felt almost biblical. Money could build things, but it could also quietly tear them apart, and that was a message some people preferred not to hear too loudly. Number 7. The Revolution Will Not Be Televised by Gil Scott-Heron.
The revolution will not show you pictures of Nixon blowing a bugle and leading a charge by...
Some songs didn't arrive on the radio like entertainment. They arrived like a conversation someone had been waiting to start. This piece appeared in the early 1970s, when spoken word, poetry, and soul music were beginning to cross paths in new ways. Instead of a traditional melody leading the record, the voice carried everything, sharp, rhythmic, and unmistakably clear.
We know pictures of you and Willie Mae pushing that shopping cart down the block on the dead run, or trying to...
Gil Scott-Heron delivered his words almost like a late-night commentator speaking directly to the listener. Calm, deliberate, and filled with observations about culture, media, and the way society sometimes distracts itself from real change. What made stations uneasy wasn't profanity. It was how directly the song questioned the moment people were living in. Some broadcasters worried that the record sounded less like music and more like a challenge. In a decade already filled with protests, debates, and shifting expectations,
Beverly Hillbillies and Hooterville Junction will no longer be so damn relevant, and women will not...
a voice speaking this plainly could feel unpredictable to those controlling the playlists. So in many places, it simply wasn't played. But the message traveled anyway. College campuses, small clubs, community gatherings. This was the kind of record that didn't need heavy rotation to leave a mark. It only needed someone to listen once and think about what they'd just heard. Number 6. Inner City Blues Make Me Wanna Holler by Marvin Gaye. By 1971, Marvin Gaye was already one of the most respected voices in soul music. But this record sounded different from anything he had released before. It arrived during a time when many American cities were struggling, economically, socially, emotionally. Factories were closing, neighborhoods were changing, and frustration was beginning to rise in places that once felt stable. The music itself felt heavy, almost weary. The bass line moved slowly beneath Marvin's voice, which sounded less like a performance and more like someone quietly carrying the weight of what they were seeing around them. Some radio stations hesitated, not because the song was aggressive, but because it painted a picture that was difficult to ignore. Taxes rising, streets feeling unsafe, families trying to hold things together through uncertain times.
Sometimes I sing this song, get a little happy.
For listeners living those experiences, the song didn't feel controversial at all. It felt familiar, sometimes painfully so. And when Marvin's voice reached that gentle cry in the chorus, it sounded less like protest and more like someone asking how much more a person could carry. Number 5. Backstabbers by the OJ.
They do. They smile in your face all the time. They wanna take your place.
Jays. By the early part of the decade, R&B had begun telling stories that felt a little closer to everyday life. Not fairy tales, not perfect romances, just people, and the complicated ways they sometimes treated one another. When this record arrived in 1972, it carried a groove that felt smooth on the surface. The rhythm moved confidently, and the harmonies had that familiar Philadelphia soul polish listeners loved. But the story inside it was different. The song spoke about betrayal, the quiet kind that doesn't announce itself until it's already happened. Friends who smile in your face, only to step behind you the moment you turn away. Some stations felt uneasy about the message. Program directors worried it might sound too cynical, too distrustful for daytime radio. So in certain areas, the record received less airplay than many expected. Still, listeners recognized the feeling immediately.
Oh man, what can I do to get on the right track?
Most people, by the time they reach adulthood, have met someone who fits that description. And hearing it sung so clearly almost felt like someone gently acknowledging a truth people rarely talked about out loud. Sometimes the hardest lessons in life arrive from the people standing closest to us. Number 4, Ball of Confusion, That's What the World Is Today, by The Temptations.
And it seems nobody's interested in learning from the teacher.
If the previous song described personal betrayal, this one stepped back and looked at the whole world. Released at the beginning of the 1970s, the record moved quickly, almost breathlessly, like someone trying to describe a decade that was changing faster than anyone could process. War overseas, protests in the streets. Generations suddenly disagreeing about everything from politics to music. The track built its energy through layered vocals and a restless rhythm section that never seemed to sit still. But what unsettled some radio programmers was the way the lyrics listed real events, real tensions, real uncertainty. It sounded less like escape and more like a mirror. For listeners, though, the honesty felt strangely comforting. When the chorus came around, declaring the world a ball of confusion, it didn't feel dramatic. It felt accurate. And if you're still listening with me tonight, you're probably someone who remembers how powerful these records felt the first time around. If that's the case, subscribing helps keep these stories alive. Number 3, Super Freak, by Rick James. Not every band can carry a political message. Sometimes the controversy came from something simpler, the way a record talked about desire. When this song appeared at the tail end of the 1970s, Rick James had already built a reputation for blending funk, R&B, and a stage presence that felt fearless. His music didn't ask permission to be bold. It simply arrived that way.
The kinky girl, the kind you don't take home to mama.
The groove was impossible to ignore. Sharp bass, playful keyboards, and a rhythm that felt like it belonged in a crowded dance floor long after midnight. But it was the lyrics that made certain radio stations pause. The song spoke openly about sexuality, in a way that some broadcasters felt pushed past the boundaries of what daytime radio should carry. A few stations simply decided it was easier to leave the record off their playlists. Of course, that didn't stop the music from spreading. Nightclubs embraced it immediately. Party speakers carried it across neighborhoods, and listeners who heard it once rarely forgot it, because beneath the playful attitude was something unmistakably confident. Rick James wasn't whispering about attraction, he was celebrating it. And for many listeners, the record felt less scandalous than it did liberating, a reminder that music sometimes exists simply to let people feel alive. Number 2, Wake Up Everybody, by Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes.
Everybody, no more sleeping in bed, no more.
By the mid-1970s, some soul records had started asking bigger questions, not about romance, but about responsibility. This song arrived in 1975 with the unmistakable voice of Teddy Pendergrass leading the way. Deep, powerful, and filled with a kind of urgency that didn't need to shout. The music unfolded slowly, almost patiently, giving the lyrics room to breathe.
Some the very best you can.
Teachers were mentioned, doctors, leaders, everyday people who had the ability to make the world a little better if they chose to care. For some stations, that message sounded uncomfortably close to criticism of the systems people relied on. The record wasn't angry, but it carried a tone that suggested things needed to change.
I need some help.
And change can make gatekeepers nervous. Yet listeners embraced it. Because the song didn't accuse anyone. It simply asked people to wake up and remember the responsibility we all share for the world around us. Even decades later, that message still feels quietly powerful. Number 1, Strange Fruit by Nina Simone.
Blood at the roots.
Some songs don't feel like recordings. They feel like moments in history. Although the song itself was written decades earlier, Nina Simone's haunting performances of it in the late 1960s and into the 1970s gave it a new, unsettling life during a time when America was still struggling with the same painful truths it had long tried to avoid. The arrangement was spare, almost bare. A quiet piano, a slow, deliberate tempo, and Nina Simone's voice carrying a weight that felt almost impossible to measure.
Here is a fruit for the crow.
The lyrics describe something few broadcasters were comfortable confronting. A brutal image tied directly to America's history of racial violence. For some stations, playing the record felt too disturbing, too political, too difficult for regular programming. So, it was often avoided. But when listeners heard Nina Simone sing it in concert halls and late-night broadcasts, the room usually fell completely silent. She didn't rush the words. She allowed each line to hang in the air, forcing people to sit with the meaning rather than escape it. And in that silence, the song became more than music.
To suck for the sun.
It became remembrance. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful songs are the ones that refuse to let us forget. Looking back now, it's striking how many of the songs that worried radio stations the most were simply telling the truth. Truth about power, truth about love, truth about pain, temptation, and the complicated world people were living through in the 1970s. Music has always had that ability. A 3-minute record can say things that whole speeches sometimes can't. If you remembered some of these tonight, I'm glad we took the time to sit with them together. And if you'd like to keep opening these little doors into music history, you might enjoy the next video waiting on the screen now, 10 greatest R&B bands you've never heard of, hidden gems from 1950s. Another quiet trip back to the songs that shaped our lives.